Character alignment has been a unique feature of Dungeons & Dragons since the earliest editions. It has been the source of a great degree of debate and dispute, maybe even confusion. Changes over subsequent editions have, by 5th edition, nearly completely disconnected alignment from core game mechanics. For example, spells that in 1st edition operated based on alignment, such as protection from evil, detect evil, no alignment, have been modified to now work on identifying undead, demons, elementals, or creatures from other planes. Alignment languages have left the D&D world building. Classes that had to meet alignment restrictions to retain their class features, such as paladins, who once upon a time needed to be lawful and good, druids, true neutral, and monks, any lawful alignment, have mostly been relieved from this mandated behaviour. These gradual modifications to the alignment rules in D&D may be a prelude to allowing it to wither and fall from D&D system completely, which may suit an audience which is getting older. We like to characterise thinking foes as being evil, perhaps to justify visiting violence upon them without remorse. But we are no longer certain that orcs are always evil. Monster alignment is now referred to as typically, rather than being fixed, leaving room for exceptions. You may refer to this trend to buck the norm of racial alignment, the Drizzt effect, after the eponymous hero of the Crystal Shard and other novels. But this is just one of a strong and long history of stories where the protagonist rejects their upbringing and others' prejudiced and stereotypical views. When we are young, we are drawn to simple tales of absolute good versus evil. As we enter adulthood, we're introduced to a world where absolute morality doesn't seem to exist. And although people like the idea of objective morality, it slips through the fingers like a jelly. The harder we try and keep it in a certain shape to suit ourselves, the less of it seems to be there at all. Alignment, in my gaming group at least, has become decorative rather than functional, and it could probably be dropped from the game entirely without impact. Except, I don't really want it to go. I'm going to miss it, right or wrong. Before I discuss why and what I'm going to do about it, let's just make sure that I'm describing alignment properly. Alignment is an abstract concept that places a Dungeons & Dragons character's behavioural tendencies, or worldview, on two apparently independent axes. One, a continuum between law and chaos, and a second between good and evil. This two-dimensional graph is split up into a notional 3x3 grid, creating 9 alignments. Top to bottom, left to right, we have lawful good, neutral good, chaotic good. On row 2, lawful neutral, true neutral, chaotic neutral. And on row 3, lawful evil, neutral evil, chaotic evil. The law chaos axis was the part of alignment introduced to D&D first, and it comes from inspirational source material such as Paul Anderson's novel 3 Hearts and 3 Lions. That story described characters taking sides in a conflict between two cosmic worldviews. Chaos, as represented by wilderness, elves, wild magic, paganism, and fairies on one side, and law representing civilization, humans, knights, science, Catholicism, and iron and steel on the other. In the context of the story, the lead character is transported to a world similar to our own, but one on the brink of war between law and chaos. And after dalliances and betrayals at the hands of the Fae, accepts his place as a paladin of law, albeit not without his own doubts. So many subjective characteristics are bound to the ideas of law and chaos that it leaves us with a lot of work to do deciding which side of things we are on, particularly when we place it in the context of a polytheistic or atheistic universe. Saruman from The Lord of the Rings, for example, is a force for law. He seeks to conquer the wilderness and industrialise, build and rule civilization. Good and evil was added later to D&D and represented a continuum between selfless behaviour that upholds the rights of other living beings, enshrined in the phrase, "the means are as important as the ends," or selfish behaviour, where the ends definitely justify the means, and use of coercion, theft, violence, assault, or even murder are legitimate ways of getting your own way. Alignment was always descriptive of acts, not prescriptive. It didn't predetermine character behaviour. The accumulation of acts during the game aligned a certain way would define an overall character alignment. The player selects an alignment initially because they have a concept of what their character believes and how their character might behave. The DM was always expected to track character alignment from that starting point based on what the character does during a game, to the point of changing the character's overall alignments to better reflect an accumulation of what the character did. Now, I don't know any Dungeon Master that went to the effort of tracking alignment on a continuous basis. That's a lot of paperwork and effort, even for a small group, and for very few dramatic rewards. Only if a character did something truly at odds with their stated alignment did it ever crop up, and only then, usually when it was a paladin that was falling from grace. And then there was the ever-present likelihood that the DM and the player could fundamentally disagree about the definitions of law and chaos, and the confusing philosophies behind good and evil acts. The law-chaos axis always seemed to me to be less controversial than good and evil. But that seems to be because choices between society, collective weal, and a wild nature and individualism seem to involve less murder. I didn't want debate at a game table over whether killing someone was evil if it was justified because their victim had done bad stuff. And I was unsatisfied with the Tolkien-esque "all orcs and goblins are evil by nature." I wanted to create an alignment system that allowed a quick and broad general description of a character's worldview and subsequent behaviour, without bringing too much of a real-world philosophy and morality into the mix, but something that might be tied even loosely to race, magic, and other characteristics of a setting. What I came up with was tied to the classical model of the elements. Consider the following transformations. Law is earth. Good is water. Chaos is air. Evil is fire. Lawful neutral becomes earth. Lawful good becomes earth-water or clay. Neutral good becomes water. Chaotic good becomes air, water, rain, storm, lightning. Chaotic neutral becomes air. Chaotic evil becomes air, fire, smoke. Neutral evil becomes fire. Lawful evil becomes earth, fire, or magma. True neutral as an alignment always had some problems. It was trying to represent either an active or a passive view of law chaos or good evil, or perhaps an inability to engage with these values. All beasts below a certain value of intelligence were true neutral. But did this mean that characters who were neutral would behave like beasts? In elemental terms, we have a further two combinations of states that might be considered to be neutral, where the elements somehow cancel each other out. Consider good, evil. This becomes water, fire, which becomes steam, like the breath of life. Lawful chaos becomes earth, air, which becomes dust, or salt, maybe. There was, in many historical cultures, a notional fifth element outside of fire, earth, air and water. This fifth element, quintessence if you like, is sometimes considered an equal part of the universe as any of the other four, and sometimes a combination of the four, a primary element. The stars were once considered by some Greek philosophers as made of this quintessence. I propose the idea of soul stuff, mana, magic, being this stuff, perhaps aligned along the axis of steam to dust. A character would be defined not just by the element, but also on this scale of intensity, from high potentiality of steam to stasis and dissolution of salt. Water can be a tidal wave or a trickling stream. Air could be a hurricane or a very gentle breeze. Earth, as an element, is probably closest to the concept of stasis, particularly dust, whereas high potentiality Earth might represent high degree of pattern or form or scale, mountains rather than sand. Traditionally, fire is closest to potentiality, high energy, but the aspect of fire closest to stasis perhaps is the cold of a vacuum. It is the absence of energy. So in my game world, instead of alignment, all thinking creatures have an elemental alignment, which in some ways mirrors their default way of thinking, and their common behaviours and attitudes, but also an intensity, which sort of mirrors the scale of their soul, magic, cosmic potentiality, significance. So an earth-minded dwarf could be a towering mountain, or the driest abrasive sand. Your fiery orc warlord may be more of a blazing wildfire, or a candle in the dark, an ignition point that will not allow his comrades to just give up and die. Sylvan elves may be soft, enveloping mist, opaque and unknowable, or harness the fury of the crackling storm. Demons can have minds that billow, choke, disintegrate, or those that simply suffocate, as they contain little to sustain life and thought. It's not a perfect model, but as I am using it more in my world building, It's adding links to racial creation myths, the magic of gods, and the nature of magic in strong ways. Reinventing alignment, linking it to core mechanics in the world. It feels better to me than the gradual removal of traditional alignment from D&D. Hopefully, this gives you something to think about. No promises, but I might come back to this topic to focus on certain things that interest me. Until then, thank you for listening.